Hey, welcome back to The Dive. Today on the show, we're really excited to welcome back legendary investor Rick Rule. Rick is here to discuss Donald Trump's return to mainstream social media, China's access to advanced semiconductors being limited, the possibility of the end of the petrodollar, oil, uranium, the stories he likes during earnings season, and we're also going to get his hot take on the U.S. planning to ban gas stoves. Be sure to stick around to the end of the video to hear details about Rick's next popular Bootcamp program. Its focus is on silver, and you can find the link in the description below to sign up. Hey, Rick, welcome back to The Dive.
Cassandra, it's a pleasure to be back on with you. Thank you for having me back.
Yes, thank you so much for joining us again today. Okay, so Rick, after a little more than 2 years, former President Donald Trump's Facebook and Instagram accounts are being reinstated. What are your thoughts on Trump's return to mainstream social media?
Cassandra, as you probably know, I'm not attracted to any politician. I guess the amusement factor of having Trump back on the scene is good for me. He makes people who make me uncomfortable feel uncomfortable. And so from my point of view, that's a good thing. Unfortunately, he makes me feel uncomfortable too. So that exposure is a mixed blessing. I'm delighted, frankly, that he's allowed back on social media. To the extent that they declined access to social media to politicians who lied, there wouldn't be any politicians on social media. The fact that Trump was excluded, I think, had to do with the fact that his lies are inconvenient to the people who run much of social media. So I guess on balance, limiting censorship, that is stopping, changing a policy, removing right-wing liars for the benefit of left-wing liars is a good thing. But I think, too, that Trump, other than amusement value, anybody who holds politics up to bad light, who defames politics, whether intentionally or not, is a hero in my regard. I realize that Trump doesn't make a parody of himself on purpose, but very often in discussions with people about the futility of politics, particularly if they're of a progressive persuasion, I can hold up Trump, which becomes very useful to me. Similarly, of course, if I'm disparaging politics and the person I'm talking to is of a more conservative persuasion, I can hold up either Trudeau or Biden. And so in that sense, the three of them are all useful for me. Tweedledum, Tweedledummer, and Tweedledummest. And they're all interchangeable from my point of view.
Japan and the Netherlands are poised to join the U.S. in limiting China's access to advanced semiconductor machinery. Do you think it's possible for the U.S. to implement its own domestic chip production? How closely are you following the tech sector?
I don't follow the tech sector particularly. I do believe that the United States has the technological and manufacturing capability, if they would like to replace over the 5-year time frame China-sourced chips. Particularly, I think, because Taiwan, no friend of the mainland, has very advanced capability in chip technology. I also think that the attempted U.S. embargo of technology against China will be very difficult. First of all, given the fact that some companies which are controlled by alleged allies will probably want to avoid sanctions and deal with the Chinese. And the Chinese capabilities in reverse engineering are at least as good as ours, which is to say they could steal our technology with the same facility that we steal theirs with.
Saudi Arabia's finance minister said the kingdom is open to discussions about trade in currencies other than the U.S. dollar. Do you think that we're seeing the end of the petrodollar?
I don't think that we're seeing the end of the petrodollar, but I think that you're going to see some substantial deterioration around the edges. Remember, Cassandra, that prices are set on the margin. You don't need to destroy the petrodollar to weaken the dollar itself. What you need to see is lesser reliance on the US dollar as a medium of exchange and a store of value. And what you're seeing out of Saudi Arabia is just one part of the process where the dollar's status as a reserve currency comes into question. The United States has for 35 years weaponized the dollar, which is to say that the United States has tried to enforce extraterritorially its policy preferences on other people, both through the dollar and through the SWIFT banking system. And there are various societies that have different points of view on major issues in the United States who don't appreciate American meddling in their domestic affairs. I can understand perfectly that if the United States was being subjected to extraterritoriality by the Saudis, trying to put, as an example, Sharia law in place in the United States, that the United States would, of course, object to it. And although you didn't ask me, Cassandra, I think the other threat to the U.S. dollar is simply the bad arithmetic around U.S. Treasury securities, the deepest and most liquid savings and investment markets in the world. The U.S. 10-year Treasury pays you about 3.5% a year as of this call, in a currency that the Congressional Budget Office suggests is losing its purchasing power by between 7 and 7.5% per year. That means that the value proposition offered up by the U.S. Treasury is that the government itself absolutely promises to reduce your purchasing power by 3.5% compounded for 10 years. Jim Grant calls this return-free risk. The real enemy to the dollar isn't in Riyadh, it's in Washington.
Now, what do you think about China's relationship with Saudi Arabia moving forward?
I think both countries are acting in their own best interests. The Chinese need continued access to oil and gas. The Saudis need to defend their markets. I have a reasonably close friend who is Saudi. I've known him and done business with him for 30 years. He and I were talking on the phone about 2 weeks ago, and he said, Rick, for 50 years, we have felt a sense of security being protected by the U.S. and Saudi. Now many of us feel the need to be protected from, rather than by, the U.S. I think that comment says an awful lot. I continue to believe that the primary currency for bilateral trade between most countries in the world will be the U.S. dollar. I just think it's going to be a lot less dominant than it's been in the past. Two, when the Saudis are looking to capital investors or when they're looking to physical infrastructure for oil and gas, they aren't going to buy Chinese supplies for the simple reason that the Chinese aren't as good in oil field equipment and oil field services than the United States. But make no mistake, there are lots of countries in the world that would do well to have better bilateral relationships that didn't run through Washington, D.C.
The EU is heading for talks over how to further curb Russian revenues from exports of oil products. What is your read on the global oil market?
Well, I guess the Europeans could start by not using Russian oil and gas. Most of what comes out of Brussels, which is to say the EU, is pure gas. Resources are fungible. And if the Russians aren't able to sell their gas in Europe, the Russians will sell their gas in Japan and China and other places. And the Europeans will find replacement supplies from those supplies that were displaced to serve the markets that Russia now occupies. I mean, this is a really, really, really funny circumstance. Funny in a tragic sort of sense. We're fighting maybe the world's first politically correct war, which is to say we're trying to fight the Russians, and the Russians are trying to fight us, but they're trying to do it in a place where all of the victims are confined to the Ukraine. There are a wide variety of Russian products and services which are popular among the European populace that haven't been included in the sanctions list. This is truly the oddest war that it has ever been my occasion to watch. Remember, too, that any policy pronouncements you hear out of Moscow or Brussels or the United States are just that. They aren't grounded in fact at all. They are grounded in an attempt to mobilize public opinion in the interest of the people who are uttering them. Don't look for facts out of capitals.
The U.S. is planning to ban gas stoves due to rising concern about harmful indoor air pollutants emitted by the appliances. Do you think that this ban makes sense?
This is really, really, really rich. I enjoy looking at the photographs of Davos, where 2,200 private jets deplaned into a fleet of SUVs while the big thinkers got together to tell us to get rid of our gas stoves and drive less. Um, all I can do is laugh. The wonderful thing about all this, Cassandra, is that at some point in time, this is going to spark a backlash. It's going to spark a backlash among all kinds of people. People who normally wouldn't be, how would you say it, described as freedom-oriented voters, are going to look at the idiocy coming out of the World Economic Forum, the idiocy coming out of the big thinkers of the political class, the improbability that the policy prescriptions that are being put in place are going to solve any useful purpose. And my suspicion is that for a brief moment, at least, sanity might return to politics. I saw a really interesting statistic, Cassandra, that your viewers might be interested in around things like fossil fuels. The world has now spent $4.6 trillion on alternative energy production. By the way, I'm not anti-alternative energy. I've invested. But anyway, $4.6 trillion to replace gas stoves, let's call it. As a consequence of that, the market share of fossil fuels in energy production has declined all the way from 82% to 81%. We reduced fossil fuels market share over 30 years by 1% through the expenditure of $4.6 trillion. Clearly, these big thinkers, the Trudeaus of the world, the Bidens of the world, the Merkels of the world, can't add or subtract. They live in a narrative-driven world. Such a narrative-driven world that they don't feel any irony at all in taking a private plane to Davos and being squired around in an SUV.
Okay, we can't let you go without talking about uranium. Before 2022 ended, Japan had approved a plan to revive the use of its nuclear energy. Why do you think Japan is joining a global shift back to nuclear energy?
Public opinion has allowed them to. The Japanese government and Japanese industry never wanted to step away from nuclear. But after Fukushima, the Japanese public felt that they had been misled by the Japanese government and by Tokyo Electric Power. Feelings that I think I share. I'm not Japanese, but I think they were misled. What's happened in the last 3 or 4 years is two things. The energy insecurity that Japan faces as a consequence of not having much by way of resources and being reliant on other countries that have geopolitical challenges for resources has become evident to the Japanese people, even as their power bills have risen substantially beyond global norms. The second thing that's happened is that part of the green agenda, which is to say that part around particulate loadings, air pollution, and carbon, is important in Japan. The consequence of those two factors is that public opinion in Japan has changed from 70% opposed to nuclear to 62% for nuclear, which has given license to the government of Japan, Japan Inc., to restart the Japanese nuclear fleet. By the way, a policy prescription which is underway as we speak.
There's currently a push to sanction Rosatom following a report from the Washington Post indicating that they have been aiding the Russian war effort. What impact do you think sanctions on Rosatom would have on the uranium market?
I don't think that there's any doubt that a Russian uranium firm is active in supporting the Russian war effort. The only part of the global uranium supply chain which is important that's located in Russia is enrichment and re-enrichment. Were we in uh, an environment where uranium was tighter than we are in today, that would be a problem. But ironically, the shortage of enrichment capacity in Russia probably increases the utilization of primary ore, which is to say, it's probably good for the uranium producers. Looking longer term, I think that Russia's dominance in the processing, fuel fabrication, and reprocessing business is going to be challenged. I think one of the outcomes of this skirmish in Ukraine has been that countries that have thought for 40 years that geopolitical risks on a global basis were decreasing are rethinking that. And I think that you're going to see reprocessing capacity begun to be built in earnest in countries outside Russia.
Okay, so Rick, now that we're into earnings season, what stories are you following closely?
Well, I think the surprise in the earnings space is going to continue to come in the energy sector. I think that people expect the worst out of conventional oil and gas businesses because their political leadership always tells them that these businesses are going to cease to exist in 2030. Meanwhile, at today's prices, they're making money hand over fist. So I think that the surprises in the oil and gas sector will continue to be good. In the base metals and precious metals sectors, I think that the news is going to be mixed. We're beginning to see, we have been for 12 months, seeing real inflation, both in terms of inputs, energy and labor in particular, and also into capital costs. So as an example, building a mine in Northern Ontario may now be 25% more expensive than it was at the time that the feasibility study was launched. So I do think you're going to begin to see some negative operating surprises in the mining business. And I think that you're going to continue to see capital cost blowouts in terms of new project construction. I don't see any way around it.
Rick, before we let you go, we know you have another one of your popular boot camps coming up this February. We're wondering if you could just give us some more color on this and share with our audience where to go to learn more about it.
Thank you for the opportunity. This is a silver investors boot camp. You will recall, and some of your listeners will, Cassandra, that last year we had a hugely successful uranium boot camp where we had the honor of taking about 3,300 people through the uranium boot camp, through the uranium market overviews, all kinds of stuff. We're doing the same thing in silver. And we chose silver because we polled our customers and asked them what topic they wanted to hear about. And silver won. So we're going to give people an overview of the silver market, how it's produced, where it's produced, how much it costs to produce it, what are the uses for silver. We're going to have some of the living legends in the silver business talk about what was involved in building multi-billion-dollar silver companies from scratch, and how the lessons that they learned make them better silver and stock investors. We will talk to analysts and portfolio managers with 20 and 30 years experience in the silver business, different from many of the sort of internet talking heads who didn't learn to spell silver until the silver squeeze 2 or 3 years ago. Most importantly, I think this is 8 hours, but you'll be able to revisit that recording on your computer for 6 months. The links will be live for 6 months. I know myself with the Uranium Investors Bootcamp, despite the fact that I know the material pretty well, and in fact produced the bootcamp, I've replayed the tapes 4 times. So you'll have access to this information from the Silver Investors Bootcamp for 6 months. Importantly, Cassandra, like any of our investor education products, there's an absolute money-back guarantee. If you pay the tuition, which is $99 US, and you don't think that you got your money's worth, if you don't think I delivered what I promised, email me, no questions asked, I'll give you the money back. Now, the truth is, with the Uranium Bootcamp, with I think it was 3,300 attendees, I think we got 30 refund requests. It turns out, if the quality of the program is very high, the guarantee is free. Nonetheless, the guarantee is there. If you don't think you got your money's worth out of the Silver Investors Bootcamp, let me know. You get your money.
Perfect. So where should they go to get tickets? Your website or?
Absolutely. Probably should have forwarded you a link, but it's ruleinvestmentmedia.com.
Perfect. All right. Well, thank you so much. That's exciting, and hope you have a good time at it. And thank you so much for joining us today, Rick. We'll talk to you again later.
Thank you very much. Bye-bye.
Thank you all so much for tuning into our show today. We really hope you enjoyed it. And if you want to learn more about silver, we've linked Rick's Silver Bootcamp registration in the description below. It's starting on February 11th, so act fast. We'll see you tomorrow, and bye.